In this lecture, we'll continue with the theme of water and salt balance, focusing on how terrestrial animals cope with their osmotic and ionic challenges. Respiratory evaporative water loss is reduced by cooling of the exhaled air, as I illustrated above, particularly in small mammals. This is a graph of the temperature of exhaled air compared to the ambient temperature for a variety of animals. You can see the blue line is an example of a dog, which has a normal body temperature of about 37 degrees. The temperature of its exhaled air is much below its body temperature across a wide range of temperatures, and it gets cooler as the ambient temperature gets cooler. The red line shows data for a wren, a very small bird. Birds too are able to cool their exhaled air temperature much below their normal body temperature, which is about 40 or 42 degrees. The black dots indicate the exhaled air temperature of a wide variety of very small mammals, and you can see that they exhale air that's just slightly above the ambient air temperature across a wide range of temperatures. This is an important way that these small mammals recover respiratory water losses. The sum of cutaneous and respiratory water loss is called total evaporative water loss. The absolute amount of evaporative water loss increases with body mass, but when we look at it on a mass-specific basis, as we learned earlier, dividing by the mass of the animal, we find that small animals have much higher mass-specific evaporative water losses than large animals. In other words, the mass-specific total evaporative water loss scales with negative allometry to body mass. This is because small animals have a greater relative amount of surface area, and so they have greater relative rates of cutaneous water loss. They also have higher mass-specific metabolic rates, meaning that they breathe a lot more for their size, and so they have higher respiratory evaporative water loss rates. This is one of the reasons that larger animals can go longer without drinking. They simply turn over less water per body mass than small animals. The total mass-specific rate of evaporative water loss varies among phylogenetic lineages and is lower in xeric or dry adapted species. This is a figure from your textbook of mass-specific rates of evaporative water loss for different types of animals that live in both dry and moist environments. The top two groups are both crustaceans. Ghost crabs are very terrestrial and they have fairly low rates of evaporative water loss. Fiddler crabs are semi-terrestrial, coming in and out when the tide goes down, and they also have fairly low rates of evaporative water loss. On the other hand, isopods that live in intertidal environments and are fairly wet all the time have much higher rates of evaporative water loss. Pillbugs are the small terrestrial isopods that live in your house, and you can see they have much lower rates of evaporative water loss compared to their relative, the intertidal isopod. Terrestrial insects, you can see, like the locust and the tsetse fly, have very low rates compared to the other arthropods. In red, you can see a group of vertebrates, and you can see that the two amphibians, the frog and the toad, have much higher rates of evaporative water loss than the reptiles, mammals, and birds. You can see that the two lizards have extremely low rates of evaporative water loss, and this is because they have very low metabolic rates compared to the mammals and birds, and they also have very tight skin adapted for living in dry environments, which reduces cutaneous evaporative water loss. Notice also that the desert spadefoot toad has much lower evaporative water loss than a semi-aquatic frog. Similarly, the brown towhee is a bird that lives in deserts and has much lower rates of water loss than the finch, and the desert kangaroo rat has very low rates of water loss compared to a mouse. The rate of fecal water loss depends on osmolytes in the undigested food in the gut. Basically, the less digestible a diet is, the greater the rate of fecal water loss will be, because this undigested food necessarily attracts water to it to stay hydrated. In general, herbivores, for example, will have much greater fecal water losses than carnivores simply because the plant material they eat is high in fiber and will be less digestible and thus will attract more water. This is the basis for eating high fiber or high bran diets as a laxative. A simple example I like to give is for you dog owners out there. If you feed your dog the less expensive dog food that has lots of fiber and fillers in it, then they're going to make very large piles, and if they eat a more digestible diet, the piles will be smaller. Urinary water loss is related to a number of factors, including the UP ratio, salt intake, protein intake, and the type of nitrogenous waste that an animal produces. In terms of the UP ratio, remember this is the osmotic concentration of the urine relative to the osmotic concentration of the plasma. A high UP ratio indicates that the animal can produce a very concentrated urine and thus conserve a lot of water. Generally, the kidneys of both amphibians and reptiles cannot produce a very concentrated urine, and so the UP ratios are generally less than or equal to about 1. Birds and insects can produce urine with a UP ratio of about up to 4. Mammals, however, can produce much more concentrated urines, and small mammals, especially desert-adapted ones, can produce urine with UP ratios as high as 26. Now you have to remember that this is just what the kidney can do in terms of producing the initial urine. I'll show you later that birds, reptiles, and insects have other tricks to reduce their urinary water losses. These include the types of nitrogenous waste that they produce and post-renal modification of the urine by the gut to recover more water. Salt intake produces an osmotic load. If you eat saltier food, then you'll need to excrete more salt and therefore water. Remember, it's all about ion homeostasis. So if you take in more ions than you need, your body needs to get rid of them. Unfortunately, these ions need to be in solution to get rid of them, so they drag more water along with them when they're excreted. High protein diets also increase the rate of urinary water loss. This is again because your body is trying to maintain protein or nitrogen homeostasis. So if you consume a lot of protein with a lot of extra nitrogen, then you have to get rid of it. Getting rid of nitrogen requires the production of nitrogenous wastes, which also produce an osmotic load. Here are the 3 most important nitrogenous wastes that animals produce: ammonia, urea, and uric acid. Ammonia is what is produced by the deamination of amino acids. So this is the simplest form of nitrogenous waste and requires no extra energy to make. However, ammonia, or its ionic form ammonium, NH4, is the most toxic of the nitrogenous wastes. It's also the most soluble and requires the most water to get rid of. You would expect to see ammonia or ammonium used as a nitrogenous waste in aquatic species. Urea is more energetically expensive to produce, but it's less toxic and it takes less water with it per nitrogen. You can see it has 2 nitrogens and 1 carbon and 1 oxygen. Remember that the total osmotic pressure is a function of the total amount of dissolved solutes. And so urea has 2 nitrogens, whereas ammonia has 1. So it has half the osmotic load. Uric acid is the most energetically expensive form of nitrogenous waste to produce. However, it carries 4 nitrogens in it and is very insoluble in water. This makes it a very good nitrogenous waste for conserving water. The problem with uric acid is that it's very insoluble and it tends to precipitate. Gout is a disease of humans where uric acid precipitates in the joints and becomes very painful. You might ask, how does water loss due to high protein diet relate to fecal losses? Well, overall, herbivores still lose more water in their feces because of the indigestibility of their diet than carnivores, but the nitrogen content is mitigating. So a high fiber diet with lots of nitrogen, like legumes, will require the greatest water losses compared to a diet that has lower nitrogen content. Ammonotelic animals are animals that produce ammonia as their primary nitrogenous waste. These include the bony fish, both marine and freshwater, which excrete ammonium primarily across the gills. Larval amphibians also are ammonotelic, as are crocodilians. These are all animals for which there's no shortage of water around, and so they're not too worried about losing water. Ureotelic animals are animals that primarily excrete urea as their nitrogenous waste. These include sharks and their relatives, which, as I described earlier, accumulate large amounts of urea in their blood. After amphibians go through metamorphosis and become the adult form, they excrete primarily urea, not ammonium. Among the reptiles, turtles are ureotelic, and all mammals are basically ureotelic. Uricotelic animals excrete primarily uric acid as their nitrogenous waste. These include the other reptiles like lizards and snakes, birds, and insects. These animals can produce a very dry urine because the uric acid is so insoluble. And, as I'll show you later, they all employ post-renal modification of the urine from the kidney.